Well, thank you very much. I'm Claude Barfield, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, and I'm really pleased to be here. My first time at the one of the conferences, and we have a kind of remnant here this morning, but we're also late in the conference, and late enough for me to say that, at least since I'm a first-timer here, but I've been to a lot of other conferences, I certainly want to, and this is sincere and not something that someone just says because you're on the podium and you have to say something. I really want to congratulate Asan. This is one of the most, the great combination of efficiency and courtesy is really quite extraordinary. And I think it has really made it, for me at any rate, a great 2 days, and I hope it has for you. As you know from the program, this is a session on trade and security. We've already had, I didn't go to all the sessions, but I think yesterday afternoon there was already a brief discussion of the combination of trade and security, and James Steinberg, in response to a very good question, I think from a student from Yonsei University, pointed out the high relevance and connection between trade policy on the one hand and security policy and events in the security area on the other. I'll come back to that in a minute. They are inextricably linked in my mind. And I should say that with the permission of Asan, I'd like at least for you to think about expanding the definition here to trade and not just security, but security, if you will, in a larger sense, not the numbers of troops or the numbers of the balance of power militarily, but also, I think, trade in terms of trade embedded, as it always, I think, is our trade policy I'm not talking about. I'm not talking here about trade numbers particularly or trade flows, so they are the important underpinning. But trade policy and trade institutions, particularly trade policy, embedded in larger, often embedded at any rate, in larger diplomatic, political, and yes, security goals. And it's that context that I am particularly, particularly interested in. Trade is a part of strategic considerations, I think, by all countries. And I think, I will introduce the panelists after the few introductory comments. I think this has been inevitably true in the last several decades as not just the United States, but in the last decade, the nations of Asia have moved from a heavy prevalence or a heavy priority on multilateral negotiations in the GATT and the WTO, to an increased relevance and priority to bilateral, trilateral, minilateral, if you will, or plurilateral and regional negotiations. And I would argue, we can discuss this later, that inevitably when you move in that direction, you will introduce elements beyond just trade in your decisions about where you put your resources in terms of negotiating bilateral agreements or regional agreements, and the implications not only for your economy, but also for your more general foreign policy goals. Now, I should say, and I've argued this with my friend, the international economist Jagdish Bhagwati, a number of international trade economists, this causes heartburn for them. Some think that the introduction of non-economic factors is to some degree polluting trade policy or polluting the economics. To some degree that is true, and they bemoan the fact that decisions are made not necessarily entirely on the economics or a particular economic goal, but in broader goals. But I think that is inevitable. And it is also something that we will have to live with, and I'll come back to that in terms of not just U.S., but other national policies in terms of regional trade policy in Asia. I mean, and let me just a couple of other points of fact to note, and just take the United States, which I know best. The first bilateral agreement that in the modern era, if you will, the 1980s and since, that the United States negotiated was with Israel. That was a bilateral trade agreement that had very little economic importance, but it was a strategic decision on the part of the United States. And ever since then, I think, whether you have a Republican or a Democratic, has nothing to do with the parties in the United States or particular trade policy. you have had presidents having to balance the decisions of the economics versus the larger, both upside and downside of negotiating agreements, both bilateral and plurilateral and regional. And I would say that to come specifically to East Asia or to Asia, I think this combination was set in place from what I would count as the beginning of specific policy toward East Asia in terms of trade, and that is going back 2 decades when Secretary of State James Baker said that the United States would not allow a line to be drawn down the middle of the Pacific with us the United States on one side and the nations of Asia on the other. And while he did not spell out in detail his vision, there was the beginning there of the position of a trans-Pacific regionalism in which the United States would be a leading part. It would not dominate, but it would be a part of any developing, and at that time there were no institutions to follow this through. And you saw this, I think you saw this later with the Clinton administration, with the move toward APEC. The Clinton administration was at a time of the so-called unipolar moment, so you had the beginnings of decline of Japan and still the rise of China on the horizon, so economics was more to the fore. But by the time you get to the Bush administration, which had a very active regional and bilateral trade policy, was the first administration. I think other administrations before, and certainly I think the Obama administration now proceeds along the same lines, but the Bush administration, in its published documents about trade policy, specifically listed listing the priorities and the necessary actions that other nations would have to go through to have FTAs with the United States, specifically combine economic factors on the one hand with strategic and foreign policy factors on the other hand. And nations were chosen with those combination of factors in mind. One could disagree or agree with the foreign policy or with the decisions of the Bush administration, but that was very explicit. I don't think the Obama administration or the succeeding administrations may be as explicit in terms of actual published documents as the Bush administration was, but they will be proceeding, I think, along the same lines. And getting then, again, back to East Asia, when the Obama administration came to office, it faced a situation, and I realize that I am moving quickly here, telescoping, where over the last decade in Asia, and particularly in East Asia, you had the development of 2 competing visions of an economic architecture which had major strategic implications beyond just economics. That is, the continuation and the attenuation, if you will, under Bush, of a trans-Pacific vision as embodied in APEC, which was drifting after the year 2000, and a very vigorous separate vision, which was pushed very strongly by the People's Republic of China, but other nations too, of an intra-Asian regionalism, symbolized by the ASEAN +3, the ASEAN +6, and at least until recently, the East Asian Summit. And I would argue, to sort of close off this, that the Obama administration, I think, ultimately moved in the direction of the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and the movement and back toward East Asia in terms of economic and trade policy, largely, I think, as a result, though not entirely, as a result of foreign policy and strategic considerations. There's been much talk here in the last couple of days about whether or not this was, when Obama came to office, this was a real pivot or a rebalancing. However, whatever one wants to call it, it was the administration which came into office very skeptical of new trade initiatives. Mr. Obama had then, and he has now, a very divided party under him about trade issues. So it was not likely, at least initially, that they would move in the trade area. But what he found increasingly was that it was difficult, and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, as we understand it in Washington, at least we here in Washington, were continually pounding on the White House. It is very difficult to try to make the case that the United States, as Mr. Obama said, is all in Asia, or we are back and we intend to stay, when you had done nothing or would do nothing about the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement or the pending Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which the Bush administration had as a little policy dart, if you will, thrown forward to the Obama administration. So I think you see there, and I just take the United States as an example, the inevitable combination when you're at the top in the White House or you're the prime minister or the president of a particular country, of the combination of economic factors on the one hand, and East Asia obviously is increasingly of prime importance to the United States and other countries, with political and security considerations on the other. And I think that will continue, and that, at least in my mind, forms a kind of background to the discussions we will have today. And just one final footnote, I think while one can argue about whether or not in 2009 there was an actual pivot by the United States, it is indisputable that in 2001 there was a real pivot, if you will, by the People's Republic of China when it turned from almost immediately from getting into the World Trade Organization to an offer that you couldn't refuse, as it were, for the ASEAN countries for a free trade agreement, pushing along something that had moved forward a little bit since the late 1990s, but really came to the fore, an intra-Asian vision of an economic architecture, which, as I say, had major implications for both the political and and strategic considerations. Let me finish there and introduce our excellent panel, if I can get my cards here, which fell off my desk. We're going to go in the order that we have in the program. And our first speaker will be, this is the same rules that I've been instructed, and I will be looking in an hour for a 15-minute sign up there. Our first speaker will be Tukun An, Dr. Tukun An, who is the professor of international law and policy at the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. The second speaker will be Xiang Li, who is associate professor of the School of International Relations, the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Third speaker will be John Park, who is a senior program officer at the United States Institute of Peace. And the final speaker will be Dr. Lee Hyung-hoon, who is the Dean of the Division of International Education and Exchange at Yonsei University. Dr. An.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. Dr. Barfield presented very nicely the overview in terms of economic and political aspect of this issue. Let me add a little bit about the legal aspect related to this trade and security matter. In a very tightly globalized economy, the trade measure becomes more potent and influential tool to address security concern. But at the same time, with the establishment of World Trade Organization, the legal rule on this trade measure to address security concern becomes more complicated. Actually, a long time ago, when the original design was presented to establish International Trade Organization in the middle of 1940s, at that time we thought about this issue. Trade measure becomes very important to make the economic sanctions to the country that raise security problems. So at that time, the original design was we will make some kind of exception when we need to use trade measure for the purpose of security issue. Now, this arrangement was codified in the Article 21 of the GATT in the WTO system. And so we have some kind of exceptions, but the problem is the application of this exception rule is actually very tight, much tighter than normally perceived. The rule says, okay, let me briefly read this, some part of this agreement. For example, it says that nothing in the WTO agreement shall be construed to prevent any member from taking any action which it considers necessary for the protection of its essential security interest, especially essential security interest relating to the nuclear weapon materials and relating to arms trafficking or international relations emergency. So this is the only exception embraced under the WTO system when countries try to use a trade measure under the name of national security exceptions. So Actually, during the GATT period, we have several disputes. For example, a long time ago, 1961, Ghana, Ghana had a problem with Portugal in terms of the national security issue. So at that time, Ghana imposed some trade sanction against Portugal. 1962, U.S. actually at that time made a trade embargo on Cuba. 86, that was the turn for European countries, Canada and Australia, to make a trade restriction on Argentina. Probably you remember this, the war between the EU and Argentina. And then 1985, again, at that time, the Reagan administration made a trade sanction on Nicaragua. So all these kind of issues were raised during the GATT period. But once the WTO was established, now the atmosphere was a little bit changed. In 1996, just 1 year after the establishment of WTO, at that time, again, U.S. government tried to impose a trade sanction on Cuba. And when they did that, Cuba brought the case to the WTO, suing the U.S. government based on WTO obligations. And the year 2000, at that time, the Honduras and Colombia actually made very interesting policy decision to broaden the maritime territorial area, the sphere. And that interfered with Nicaraguan the territory. So the Nicaragua at that time imposed a trade sanction. Then, again, Colombia and Honduras now brought the case to the WTO, suing Nicaraguan governments about this trade sanction. Fortunately or unfortunately, we didn't have any actual decision from the WTO related to this matter. So still we are not sure about how to interpret these provisions. What should be embraced under this very weak language of essential security interest, or another interesting the aspect of this provision in the WTO is it says, the nothing in the WTO agreement shall be construed to prevent the member from taking any action which it considers necessary for the protection of essential national security. So it says, who will decide the essential national security? It appears to be the member. So when some WTO member country claim that I consider this is a necessary measure to protect our national security, then in that case, whether WTO may have any kind of authority to reconsider this issue will become very, very controversial. In case we try to defer too much to member countries the discretionary judgment, then basically this provision will become like a license to become a cowboy. But in case we try to have some kind of elaborated principle or criteria, then it raises very, very difficult political issue of how to coordinate the national security issue between multilateral system versus the member countries' sovereign decisions. So this is a situation. Maybe the possible option is, as we have witnessed, there must be some kind of coordination between WTO and the UN Security Councils. So at least, for example, UN Security Council made a decision. Then, WTO probably could defer to that decision and then make some kind of the broad the allowance or permission to use trade sanction. But in case we have the situation in which UN Security Council may not make the definitive judgment, in that case, what to do about that situation with this potentially very influential the trade measure becomes very, very controversial for a long time. So I'll stop here, then maybe later I will follow up.
Okay. It's my pleasure to speak here, and thanks for the chance of Asan Institute. Maybe my perspective is a little different from Mr. Buffett and Mr. An. I'm going to talk about the possible influence of the TPP on China-ASEAN relations and China-US relations. Frankly speaking, it's still very hard to say TPP will affect greatly China-ASEAN relations and China-US relations. In my totally personal opinion, there are two of the most important factors: territorial disputes and economic interdependence in China-ASEAN countries' relations. And none of these two factors can be changed greatly by the TPP. And let me give some comparison. I can divide ASEAN countries into three groups. For those countries which have no territorial disputes but benefit a lot from the economic interdependence with China, the relations between China and these countries may be in the grade of A+, which means there are many active factors. And for those ASEAN countries which have territorial disputes but also benefit a lot from economic interdependence, the relations between China and these countries may be in the grade of A, which means there are not only active but also negative factors in the relations. But for the ASEAN countries which have territorial disputes but benefit little from economic interdependence with China, I mean, if there's any such country, maybe there's no, the relations between these countries and China may be in the grade of A-. That means there are many negative factors. So, all in all, if someone sees the TPP as an American effort to isolate China in the Asia-Pacific region, or if someone worries that the TPP may create an adversarial political psychology between China and the United States, or if someone describes TPP as a geopolitical power play and diplomatic power play and an economic warfare in the Asia-Pacific region. So, what should we think of some other FTAs the United States has had in the region, especially the South Korea-United States FTA? Should we, and the South Korea-United States FTA, if I'm not wrong, I guess it may be the first United States FTA with a major Asian economy and the largest trade deal of the United States since the North American FTA in 1993. And should we think that South Korea-United States degrade China-South Korea relations? And should we think that South Korea-United States FTA will damage or create an adversarial political psychology between the United States and China? Of course, my answer is no. And at least in a short term, I think China-ASEAN FTA will be much more influential than the TPP in the relations between China and ASEAN countries in the economic field. That means only for the China-ASEAN countries in the economic field, China-ASEAN FTA will be much more influential than the TPP. No matter how economic relations between ASEAN countries and the United States may develop, China will always be the most important neighboring country for the ASEAN countries. This has been determined by the geographic conditions. If the ASEAN countries, such as Myanmar and Laos or Cambodia, can have a more prosperous market after opening their gates to the outside world, surely China will benefit a lot from their economic development, and the economic relations between China and Myanmar or Thailand or Laos or Cambodia will be much closer than before. I think that's a little similar to the case between China and South Korea. Therefore, if it is necessary to say there should be some influence of the TPP on China-ASEAN relations or China-US relations, I prefer to be cautiously optimistic. The parallel development of the TPP and the China-ASEAN FTA, China-Singapore FTA, China-New Zealand FTA, China-Chile FTA, China-Peru FTA, and so many FTAs China has had in the Asia-Pacific region appears to yield large and mutual benefits to both sides of the Pacific. It is noteworthy here that Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand are the original signatories of the TPP, while Peru has been negotiating for the membership of the TPP. If the TPP can be successful in the future, which means the United States, ASEAN countries, and other TPP countries, such as Chile and Peru or Singapore or New Zealand, can share an open and prosperous market, and US economic and strategic ties to the region may be expanded and strengthened. And ASEAN countries and other TPP countries, such as New Zealand, Chile, and Peru, may serve as a bridge between China and the United States, and the biggest two economies, not only in the region, but also in the world. So, to be more specifically, I would like to say 3 points. First, the TPP would promote deeper economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region, just like China-ASEAN FTA would do in East Asia. Economic integration spanning the Asia-Pacific region would deliver much greater benefit to all of the key economies in the Asia-Pacific region, including Japan, South Korea, of course, China, and the United States. Second, the TPP would provide a model for consolidating the existing numerous, maybe more than 10 or 20 free trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific region, and thus chart a way out of the current noodle ball of overlapping trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific region. That means there have been too many FTAs existing in FTA, maybe a little confusing. And third, the TPP may level the playing field for US exports to Asian markets, and thus fix the US trade imbalance with major Asian economies, especially US trade imbalance with China. And as we have all known that the trade imbalance, trade disputes, and currency exchange rate issue have been greater trouble for US-China relations nowadays than ever before. After all, the TPP is not a military and a political alliance against any country, including China, but a trade and economic cooperation agreement. That means want to include in any country. The TPP and the FTAs China has had in the Asia-Pacific region may develop for competitive reasons. I never deny there's no any competitive reasons, maybe, yeah. But it may also encourage cooperation among different countries. They will reduce obstacles to further economic integration and amplify the gains to both United States and China and amplify the gains to all of the key economies. And if TPP can evolve into an overall region-wide FTA, I think, especially if the agreement successfully evolves into an FTA all over the Asia-Pacific region, and the United States and China can both benefit a lot from it, and South Korea, Japan, can also benefit from it. And some scholar, not me, some scholar, I remember the scholars, 3 scholars from United States, they anticipate that if China can get its welfare gains on purely Asian trade track, such as China-ASEAN FTA or China-South Korea-Japan FTA, the gains could only be no more than $100 billion by the year of 2025. But China can get its economic gains, welfare gains on an FTA AP would be more than $350 billion by the year of 2025. So it's very optimistic of TPP for all of the key economies. So in my personal opinion, the Chinese or the other Asian countries, it's really unnecessary for us to worry about the future of the TPP, the future impact of the TPP on China-South Korea relations, on China-ASEAN relations, on China-US relations. Yeah, it's a good news. I have my good wish for it. Yeah, that's all. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. When we look at the trade and security aspect, I think there's always the challenge of how we're going to package this and how we're going to talk about it. Given the broad attention and theme of the Asia-Pacific pivot strategy, I wanted to look at trade and security as two key pillars to this concept and the strategy. And certainly, these days, it's raised more questions than it's provided answers. We see now movement away from the term pivot and greater reference, as Claude was mentioning, to the term rebalancing. The three areas I wanted to cover first was to provide some context in terms of the strategy. And the second, look at the regional dynamics. Some of the key points have been made about the tremendous pace of interdependence among the countries in the region. And then the third part, I wanted to look at some of the challenges ahead. With respect to the context, if you look at the formulation of the Asia-Pacific pivot strategy, it's amazing how it has become a framework to assess a wide range of issues. So if you can think of pretty much any issue, the question is, how does this relate to the Asia-Pacific pivot? And with this, there are tremendous growth of different opinions, views, both sense of optimism, other areas of concern. And to zero in on the U.S. side, in observations of members of Congress, you could see a snapshot of this type of phenomenon. There is a sense of optimism when it comes to the connotations of job growth, the creation of jobs resulting from expanded trade. That is a key element of the Asia-Pacific strategy. But at the same time, there's a concern because we hear also on the security dimension of all this, the expanded activities of the U.S. military in the region. And all of this taking place in an environment in the United States where we're seeing the defense budget shrink. And in the region, we see the PLA's opaque growth continue. There's also the other connection in terms of chronology here. As we draw down, as the U.S. draws down in Afghanistan, as things look like, although there are difficulties, but at least a forward movement in Iraq, that the time is right to do this rebalancing, to do the shift to Asia-Pacific as for an American public that has been exhausted by a lot of things related to the Middle East. The Asia-Pacific has certain connotations that is something of a rallying effect on the American public. But as these trends occur, the second part here, the regional dynamics, are important to consider. If you look at it from an outsider's perspective in terms of what's been happening here, it's at times very difficult to reconcile this high-level economic interdependence among the countries, specifically in Southeast Asia. And at the same time, in a parallel fashion, these headline-grabbing stories about these territorial maritime boundary disputes, specifically in South China Seas, these very high-profile joint military exercises and so forth. So again, from a policy's perspective, very difficult to explain what in some cases looks very contradictory. And in the case of Northeast Asia, we see North Korean military provocations that when you're sitting in Washington, there's a lot of concern that this could spill out and we could see an escalation ladder that leads to tremendous instability. But when you visit the region and you talk to local analysts in here, this is really par for the course. It is a heightened level of concern. There were very serious moments in 2010. But as we sit today, there is concern that continues about North Korea, but certainly not commensurate to the headlines. This leads to the notion of the pivot by way of certain understandings related to U.S. freedom of action, that this idea of rebalancing from one region and investing and focusing more on the Asia-Pacific area gives the United States a certain prime mover advantage. But given the tremendous progress in these other areas, you have to look at the behavior of the countries involved. And particularly in Southeast Asia, it's interesting that if you look at each of the individual countries, they're very carefully weighing their options. They're calibrating a tailored package of security and trade. It's not as if one particular Southeast Asian country would look to get pretty much everything that it seeks in the trade and security area for one provider. So it's interesting in the broader scheme of things how there has been this integration among the countries in the region and increasing interactions with China and the U.S. efforts with TPP and other measures to, in some cases, to catch up in terms of what's been happening in the areas here in the region. To move to the final part about challenges ahead, with this concept, there is a great sense of challenge and a great sense of opportunity for the United States because it is a key element of revitalizing a very difficult economic situation in the United States. But with this, the tremendous task of keeping instability and insecurity in the region at bay, and this is all happening in a very rapidly evolving Asia-Pacific region. Here, I would conclude with the notion that when we do look at the Asia-Pacific strategy and the pivot going forward, there will be, I think, the challenges of recalibrating at incremental steps. It's not as if you lay out the strategy and then you move forward. Because the region is changing so dynamically, and there's certain facets that I think have to be incorporated as we move along, the Asia-Pacific strategy will be evolving with it. And then the question is, are you going to do it in a reactive manner, or are you going to try to be proactive about it? I think that type of management of this strategy from all those involved will be critical. Then it raises a question through which mechanism. If it's the United States engaging each country bilaterally, certainly that raises questions just about logistics. The other element of the United States joining organizations like the East Asia Summit, very important. But this broader sense of sustainability, but also mechanisms, I think are very important questions to address ahead. Let me conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Ali, Professor Lee?
All right. Good morning, everyone. Here in Korea, academics are highly compartmentalized, meaning that for someone like me who is in foreign policy security area, political science, international relations, we rarely tread into the realms of economics. So for me to be talking about trade or economic aspects would immediately draw attention and comments from my colleagues in the economics department, so I have to be very careful here. And therefore, when I speak of trade, I will always link it up with security aspects, and that's precisely what the topic of this particular panel is this morning. I thought about it, and how do we link up the trade and security aspects, and then you look into the causal relations between these two realms, and the conventional logic, I would think, is that there's a positive correlation between trade and security. The more you trade, the better security environment will become. I think that's sort of like the conventional logic. And conversely, if the security environment is bad, if there's tension, some sort of conflict, you're not likely to trade freely or expansively, because usually if there's some sort of a military conflict or tension, you would expect there to be some sort of a sanction or what have you. So that's the conventional logic. Now, can we apply that conventional logic to the Asia-Pacific region? And the answer has to be yes and no. I think there's some part of that conventional logic that you can apply, but at the same time, there are some exceptions because of the unique nature of this particular region, which I'd like to talk about a little bit. There's absolutely no doubt that the economy in this region is vibrant. In fact, it may be the most vibrant of all parts of the world. And even between the United States and China, we talk about the G2 and we talk about all the military tensions, maybe even China substituting for the role that the Soviet Union might have played during the Cold War period. Despite all that, the trade even between the two is very vibrant. But despite that vibrancy in the trade relations, security relations at the same time seems to be worsening. The confidence building, particularly between China and the United States, seems to be at a halt. It's not progressing despite the vibrancy in trade and the broader economic relations. Conversely, again, the increased tension or increasing tension between the United States and China, yes, it is leading to some sort of a tension in the region, and I'll talk about that in greater details. But what's very interesting spin-off of that tension between the US and China is that it is also helping to increase trade and greater expansion of vibrancy in economic relations in the region as a whole, because the difference between now and what was during the Cold War period is that during the Cold War period, the two superpowers, of course, the US and the Soviet Union, could rely on the predictable loyalty of the satellite states. There's no such thing today. In other words, you cannot expect this sort of military, economic, or political loyalty without some sort of major concession from the G2. In other words, what that means is that both the United States and China have to work to win favors from whoever support they want to get from. And one of the tools that both countries use is trade relations or investment or what have you. So as I said, the interesting spin-off of the security tension between these two powers, China and the United States, is in fact the result of helping to increase the economic relations amongst the many countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, going back to the security aspects, some mention was made of the Obama administration. I think earlier this year, you know that in January, the Obama administration unveiled a new defense posture or policy strategy featuring Asia or Asia-Pacific region as the new security pivot. Shift to the future. Asia being defined as critical region. And there are many aspects to this new strategy, defense strategy, in terms of like build-up in Australia, sending more Marines there. I think we're expecting something like 2,500 by 2016. There is a broader reduction in the American troops forces or levels or capacity, but not in Asia. I think that commitment has been made. Aircraft carrier level also is to be maintained here. Intelligence, special operations in this region, probably going to be strengthened. And then, of course, on top of that, we've seen almost like $6 billion worth of arms sales to Taiwan, defense ties with Vietnam, fighter plane sales to Indonesia, so on and so forth. But along with all that, there's an increase also because it sort of like coincides, it goes along with that sort of increased security ties, the economic ties as well. How does China feel about that? Probably feels encircled. I think that's been the theme of China in terms of its security posture for many decades, the encirclement fear. And the response from China to that encirclement fear is, of course, the strengthening of its own military, ties with Pakistan. We've seen although very old-fashioned, Varyag in the what we call here in Korea the Western Sea or the Yellow Sea, South China Sea area, the strengthening of their submarines capacity, capability, stealth fighter. So China is responding. And of course, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with Russia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, that's also going on. What is also very interesting to point out is that, I think the U.S.-China relations is at the center stage, but there are many aspects or dynamics in the Asian region underneath the larger U.S.-China template. Asia-Pacific is fraught with bottled up tensions, historical whitewashing. We've seen that in Japan. We're seeing a lot of that. Sorry for my panelists, but we're seeing a lot of that in China. Territorial, it's also been mentioned about the conflicting territorial claims, emotional irreconciliations, particularly like between Japan and Korea. So there are a lot of latent potential for outbreaks of tensions and clashes. I think, to give specific, I don't think we have time for very specifics, but just, between Korea and Japan, the list is very easy to give, like Dokdo Island, comfort women issue, textbook issue, Korean residents living in Japan, the visitations of Yasukuni Shrine by the Japanese political leaders. These are all latent potential sort of hazards. Between Korea and China, the China's Northeast Asia project, which sort of rewrites the history of what we consider to be a very important part of our history, the Three Kingdoms, particularly the Goguryeo area, which of course is, the current northern China, Manchuria area. Eodo, we have a territorial issue. Not too many people outside of Korea may have heard of that, but that's a potential flashpoint between China and Korea. Japan and China also, Senkaku or Diaoyutai, Chinese arms buildup, which is of course quote unquote provoking Japan. There is such thing as the sort of like the like in 1950, I think you probably remember the American Secretary of State Dean Acheson's defensive perimeter of drawing sort of like outer boundary of a defensive line. China is doing something very similar, and the initial perimeter is in the high seas, which could very well include the South China Sea, Okinawa, and Taiwan. So this is, so even, never mind the U.S.-China thing, we have enough sort of potential flashpoints of our own. And you know what? I haven't even begun to speak about North Korea. So we have our hands full in terms of these aspects. But at the same time, because of these security insecurity, and it's not all bad, because it is also to overcome this insecurity. We've seen cases of China sort of like trying to compete with the United States by increasing ties with the BRICS. There are discussions about the FTA between China and Japan, China and South Korea. The BOAO, which is sort of like the Asian version of Davos, which is also continuing, and China is putting emphasis on that. So these are all sort of like the realm of economics which are expanding, possibly as a byproduct of the security insecurity. I don't think I have to be very elaborate on the the trade dynamics in this region. The China, of course, everyone knows that it's a world number 2 economy now. Over $3 trillion in foreign reserves, and the list goes on and on. Korea also very dynamic. December 5th last year, 2011, was a landmark year for Korea because we topped $1 trillion mark in trade. We are number 9 in terms of the of countries in the world reaching that level. Hopefully, we're able to continue. And of course, Korea is the only country in the world with FTAs with the 2 largest markets, the United States and the EU. And we're very active in promoting FTAs. Now we already have it with, including EU and ASEAN, 45 countries. We're working on 8 more FTAs, which would include 13 countries like Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, and so on and so forth. And there are further discussions with 15 more countries, which include, of course, China, Japan, Vietnam, Israel, so on and so forth. So Korea is very, very active in terms of our economic outreach, because we're not a natural resource plentiful country. We believe that trade is the most important instrument of national survival, and we are pursuing that as such. We have, of course, the FTA with the U.S., which just got ratified in March 15th. And very interestingly, our trade with the United States, just in March, our export to the U.S. anyways, increased by 27% just in March. So I think it just goes to show for what's in stock for Korea as we head along. Japan, of course, 2 minutes if I may. Japan also, of course, has been reeling from economic recession, but can't really feel sorry for a country that's still number 3 in the world in terms of GDP. It's the second largest advanced economy, developed economy. It's the world's second largest automobile manufacturing country, largest electronics goods industry. There are 68 Japanese companies in Fortune 500. So it's still, despite the recession, a major economic power. Southeast Asia, of course, also. I mean, if you go to Southeast Asia, you can feel the economic vibrance, whether it's in Vietnam, Indonesia, or what have you. So, and I haven't even talked about Hong Kong and Taiwan. To conclude, so what do we make of all this? How do we come to some sort of a conclusion? Well, Asia, this region is very unique, very dynamic, and very interesting. And the future of this regional dynamics, certainly intertwines security and trade. There's a lot of pushing and pulling between these two factors, security and trade. The big question, of course, is which one wins out? What is the end state? Is it going to be the security, or is it going to be the economy, the trade? The good news, I think, is that the Sino-American rivalry is very different from the U.S.-Soviet rivalry of the Cold War period. One thing, I think there are two key factors, which is that during the Cold War period, the rivalry between the two superpowers, sure, but there was no economic interdependence between the Soviet Union and the United States. We have that, I believe, between China and the United States. I think that's a major difference. And another very important difference is that China is not your traditional communist state. Politically, certainly that is the case. But I think China has a very strong historical root in mercantilism. And China has espoused capitalism. Some say that it's more capitalistic than South Korea. That was the saying here in Korea for some time. So I think these two things are good news. These are good signs because these two hegemons, if you could refer to them as hegemons, China and the United States, will have their share of tug of wars, but because of these bilateral and multilateral economic links, I believe that it will have certainly a dampening effect on the security tension, although it may not completely alleviate them. Thank you, and sorry for taking too long.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn for questions and to the audience first, but I do have one question, particularly for Professor Zhang, about his view of the TPP in relation to China's own aims and goals in East Asia. You gave a very optimistic view of the ability, I applaud that and like that, but the ability to kind of integrate China into a TPP, or that we can move forward fairly smoothly. But there is one, I think, huge question there, and that is, we can't ignore the fact that and I should say as a footnote, it is not clear the United States will pull this off. The United States may not be able to add new countries, to get countries to agree to the things that are on the table. But the TPP, as envisaged by the United States, and I think by and large with the other countries, even though there may be some disagreements, is a very advanced, quite deep integrated agreement with areas that could, at least at the moment, and probably for some time, cause real problems of adjustment for China. The Chinese model, if you take its the PRC's FTAs, are much shallower FTAs. China, and this is, I'm not criticizing, these are one or the other, these are two different approaches. China has from the beginning seen the FTAs as a political tool. And that has meant it has been very flexible in the substantive terms of its free trade agreements, none of which are anywhere close to the Chorus or the EU or other more advanced agreements. I foresee problems. I'd like to get some reaction to you for how and when that you could actually pull that all together. Other speakers in China have basically pointed to the fact that the United States is pushing sort of regulatory reform, state-owned enterprises or state-influenced enterprises as a means really of keeping China out. Those kinds of things I'd like to have you respond to, and then I'll turn to questions and comments from the audience.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And of course, I cannot deny that the FTAs China has had would inevitably have some political outcomes for China and other countries, such as China-ASEAN FTA. But I think the political outcomes is not contradictory with economic effects. Yeah, so I guess I'm not the Chinese government. I'm just on behalf of myself. Right. I guess the Chinese government may just want to have some outcomes just both in political and economic field. And first, economically. Yeah, and we can benefit each other from the China-ASEAN FTA. And if can be better, if conditions can be better, maybe we can get closer political, I cannot say political relations, but political mutual trust, yeah, between China and some ASEAN countries. If we have closer economic connections with each other, and as you have mentioned, TPP is much deeper integration than the FTAs China has had with other countries. Yeah. But on the other hand, the TPP, on this, from this perspective, I just guess TPP maybe it's not so easy, yeah, for TPP to be fully integrated, yeah, and maybe in 10 years or 20 years, especially for Japan and ASEAN countries, and Japan and the United States, and for United States and ASEAN countries. Maybe it's a long way, it's still a long way behind of it, yeah, for them to go. And just the same conditions, yeah, for China, ASEAN FTAs, China, Peru, China, Singapore, China, New Zealand FTAs, maybe there is also a long way, yeah, for all the Asian Pacific economies to have a fully integrated economy. But I'm still optimistic. Maybe in 10 years or 20 years, maybe it's a long time for us. But in the whole human history, 10 years or 20 years is very short. It's just maybe a minute or second. I often speak to my students. Yeah, what do you think of European economic integration? And they say, oh, I cannot see the future of European economic integration. But I ask again, yeah, but how can you anticipate what will happen after 1,000 years? Yeah, and we cannot imagine maybe the people before 1,000 years ago cannot anticipate today's world. Yeah, they cannot anticipate. And 1,000 years ago in Asia, which countries they were? In Europe, which countries they were? But today, 1,000 years passed, everything different. So maybe I often tell my students, yeah, maybe after 1,000 years, European Union can be a fully sovereign state, yeah, and maybe after 500 years, the TPP can be an FTA, AP, yeah. So I'm optimistic for the future of both TPP.
I think with the political cycles in the United States and other countries, that's beyond the realm of imagination. But I take your point, though, that it's not just China, that, as I say, the United States is pushing something that is beyond what has been done in free trade agreements so far. So the countries of ASEAN and the Japanese, I think, are going to have to really think long and hard before they get in. Let's turn to questions and answers from the audience. Please identify yourself, and happy to have a statement as well as a question as long as it's reasonably short. We got about 15 or so minutes right here. I can see a hand. There's a
Thank you. I'm Shuja Nawaz. I'm the director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington. If I could just widen the aperture of the discussion beyond East Asia and also relate it to the main theme of the conference, to include some comment on South Asia, because we've been focusing a lot on trade and economic relations within the countries of South Asia, which for us also includes Iran and the Gulf states and Afghanistan and Central Asia. So it's an elastic definition of South Asia. It appears, I mean, in an area, South Asia, which is the least integrated economically in the world. When you look at all the regions of the world, this is a large landmass as well as a huge population grouping, which is extremely poorly integrated. But we are seeing within the last 2 or 3 years, the political leadership, particularly in India and Pakistan, taking advantage of technology and taking advantage of public opinion and their own open markets. They are now attempting to show some strategic thinking and to try and encourage trade between the two countries as a way of thawing relations, as a way of maybe ending 65 years of hostility. So in that context, I'm very sympathetic to Professor Lee's position that there is a kind of a relationship between trade and security. One study that we featured at our center shows that if India and Pakistan, which only have $2 billion of trade annually, official trade, were to go back to their trade at the time of independence in 1947, that there could well be trade in the range of $40 to $100 billion. It would create vested interest groups on both sides that would make war or hostilities impossible. 10 years ago, who would have predicted that India and China would be such major trading partners? Then if you take away services, China is India's largest trading partner. So I'd like to get some sense from the panel on the possibility of using trade to reduce insecurity and using trade as a political tool to show leadership in moving towards creating a peaceful zone. Thank you.
Anyone? Professor Lee or? Anyone, by the way, and I'll come to you. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think certainly it can be used as a political tool. And to go back to my discussion, maybe the final question that could be asked about this region is that can there be a happy ending? In other words, without having to worry about security. And certainly, I think the key is held by, in Northeast Asia anyways, China, the China factor. And I remain optimistic because I think trade and the economic interdependence and the spread of capitalism cannot but have a huge impact in terms of the domestic socio-political fabric and makeup of that society, China. Hopefully, eventually down the line, and no offense to my Chinese colleagues, that it will lead to greater pluralism in China and maybe even a semblance of democracy. And that, I believe, triggered by trade and greater economic interdependence, will be the key to permanent peace and security, certainly with the United States and the region as a whole.
If I could jump in.
Go ahead, and then I'll come.
You know, I think the difficulty, though, is when you look at trade and security, irrespective of region, it's a fundamental mismatch. Trade is a quantitative analysis. Security is qualitative in many respects. You feel insecure or you feel secure. In the case of trade, you can do all the quantitative analysis, and you can have debates about it, but still it gives you ballparks where you still stand on, I think, more firm ground. That's one aspect. The second aspect where trade is important as a policy tool for the objectives that you mentioned, but raises other challenges. Trade and different aspects of economic dynamics are being used as a policy tool in terms of sanctions. So when you look at this balance from an abstract sense of security and trade, we see the fundamental mismatch there in terms of how you do your metrics and evaluate it. Then on the other side, when you structure policy tools and implement policy tools, trade becomes something that if you do the important work of building trade agreements, doing the cross-investment and so forth, financial sanctions for a very specific, sometimes tactical rather than strategic objective, can wipe away a lot of that kind of development and lead to unintended consequences of economic flows that aren't the type of flows that we have in mind. And so in the category of financial sanctions, there's this whole phenomenon, whole literature of backfilling. As countries and responsible members of the international community adhere to sanctions, it creates opportunities for other players to go in and reap some rewards in means that we didn't intend. So this is where I go back to this notion of the mechanics and mechanisms of how to deal with these different objectives, because they are so fundamentally different and they're evolving very quickly.
Yeah, I think I can add one example. Actually, the South Korea is doing some interesting model with North Korea. As you may know, in Kaesong area, we established industrial complex. So basically, the capital from South Korea goes there, and then using North Korean the laborers, we produce something, and then trying to bring back. And actually, the South Korea tried to use free trade agreement, incorporating this arrangement. So until we have FTA with the U.S., actually, all other previous FTA tried to make a special exception to permit those products from North Korean territory as a South Korean product. So we actually use this arrangement as kind of a model to strengthen this or to alleviate security concern using international trade. I believe this model will become very interesting and important later when North Korea, if North Korea does implement the actual open policy or industrialization policy in the future.
I'll take one more question, but I want to make 2 points. I agree. I think one of Professor Lee's most important point was this comparison between the United States and Russia in the Cold War, or the Soviet system, and the United States and China today, where there was no trade really between the West and the East, or very little, the Eastern Bloc at any rate. And that is a difference. And one could argue that as the United States, with our relations with Japan and the European Union, one sign of the increasing depth of the interdependence, as it has been with Europe and Japan, is you have more and more trade conflicts. I mean, the more you trade, the more there's going to be some kind of disagreement. So let's keep that in mind. And then my second, I agree in general that over time, this will have my second caveat, is to this combination of, yes, trade liberalization hopefully at some point will lead to less conflict in terms of military conflict or more political liberalizations. But we have to point out that in history that is very erratic. Before the First World War, you had had a period of 50 or 60 years where you'd had the greatest integration of Western societies and economies that you'd ever had in terms of cross-investment, in terms of trade, and you've got a cataclysm. So it is a good sign, but it is not the be-all and end-all. I'll leave it there because I saw one question here in the back.
Han Hua from Peking University. Let me ask a kind of a theoretical question to the panelists. In my view, is that John Ekenberry once elaborate the two growing clusters of groupings in this region. One is driven by China's economic integration or trade, but the other is the United States is a strategic or security grouping. So there's two groupings going to two directions. Maybe that is something undermining the the so-called liberal hegemony in this region. And so my question is that sustainable for you to think about this liberal hegemony order in this region? Even we think the United States is trying to trying to do something by creating the TPP, but without China's participation. Do you think TTP is also sustainable? Thank you.
Anyone on the panel?
Okay. In my mind, and maybe the China and the United States can lead two different economic integration groups in the world. But in fact, first, just like you have said, the American or U.S. exports to overseas markets cannot develop without China's participation. But on the other hand, China also needs American markets, and China gets its largest trade surplus from U.S. market. So in this perspective, we can see that China and the United States need each other in economic field. And on the other hand, more specifically, TPP, the development of TPP, maybe in a short term, and nowadays only 4 members or 5 members in the TPP, and 5 or 4 other countries are negotiating for it. And the TPP is still a small trade agreement, very small scale. So it is still developing, maybe in some day in the future, And if TPP is fully developed, and if TPP want further development, and China's participation is necessary, in some day future,
I agree with that. I think, do we have, okay, I've been asked to end it. So I'm bowing to my masters. I'm sorry for the 2 of you who raised your hands. You can probably get the panel up here after we're done. Please join me in congratulating our panel on a really great and diverse set of pleas.